Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Ben DuBose here, Paulo, Alves there. Welcome into another episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing, with support from our friends over at Sports Talk 790 as well, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Today, as the Rockets are almost emerging from the All-Star break, that will officially happen Friday night in Golden State, but they are practicing today at Toyota Center, so we are getting some updates. We're thrilled to welcome in Dave Hardisty to the podcast. He's a good friend of mine personally, but you probably know him best as the owner and founder of Clutch Fans. Dave, thanks for taking the time. How are you?
Of course, Ben. Yeah, doing well. How about you guys?
Oh, cannot complain at all. Let's just jump right into, I think, the topic of the day, which is Jabari Smith Jr. I think everyone knows you as founder of the Jabari Smith fan club on Twitter. You were thrilled when the Rockets drafted him last summer, and I think he's a popular talking point now. Certainly the rookie season has been a bit underwhelming to date. He is averaging 12.7 rebounds in 29 minutes a game, but he's shooting 39% from the field, barely above 30% from three. And honestly, shooting was supposed to be his calling card. That was his biggest strength. To this point, it's been his biggest weakness. Now, you could argue that's actually a bit of a positive in that it should correct itself with time. Time will tell on that, of course. But I think it's also a good time to talk about Jabari because with Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green each dealing with injury issues at the moment, and even when they do come back, those are the type of injuries that it's doubtful they come right back, and even if they are playing, immediately go into 35 minutes per game roles like everything never happened. So I think with Eric Gordon gone and now KPJ and Jalen both dealing with injuries, Jabari's going to get more touches. He's going to get shot attempts. I know that there was the recent furor on Twitter about the article from Mark Spears and Steven Silas saying they don't run plays for him. Jabari, that is, well, regardless of whether there's plays run for him or not, he's going to get a lot of shots because, quite frankly, who else is on the current Rockets? So, Dave, let's just start with the 30,000-foot view. As far as what Jabari has done to date, which I think is a little bit underwhelming. Now, there is context. He's 19 years old. He's the youngest guy in his draft class. And it's not as if Paolo Banchero is lighting the world on fire either in Orlando. That's someone that Jabari was compared a lot to in the draft process. And while he's been better, it's not just night and day different, at least not to this point, especially with the shooting. At the same time, look, there's people that are concerned when they see him clanking wide open shots and not coming close on threes that are wide open. And that's supposed to be his biggest strength. From a 30,000-foot view, what's your view of Jabari at the moment? And is any of the optimism that you felt when the Rockets drafted him last June, has any of that been, I guess, diminished a bit by the fact that he's had this slow start through the first 55 games or so?
Yeah, great questions. So, like for me, Jabari, there's no doubt about it. He's been disappointing, right? Like, I mean, all those things are true. He's 19. There's a lot of development to do. It's clear. I think he's struggling in a lot of ways that kind of can happen in a rookie season. At the same time, it's the shooting, in my opinion, that is just flat out disappointing that I don't have much of an explanation for, to be honest, because the guy really has an impeccable form, I think, coming in, showed a lot at Auburn how good his shooting was, and it's gotten worse through the season. Like it's really he wasn't great in summer league. He struggled a little bit. Then he had a good stretch, and now it's just gotten really, really rough. And so I do look at this like this is definitely Jabari's issue. I would like to see the organization, help him as much as humanly possible here, get this righted because this guy should be a really good shooter. But that part is definitely a problem. I mean, if Jabari continued on this track shooting, then yeah, you could talk about a completely different projection than certainly the one I had. And that would be disappointing. That'd certainly be on me. I love Jabari and I still do. And I still think he's going to be just fine. But there's no doubt his rookie season from shooting the basketball has been a big issue.
Let me
go ahead.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up. There was some data that Nathan Fogg put out on Twitter about a week ago that Jabari is actually shooting 37% from the corners, which I find really interesting because the corners are, of course, the shortest three-point shot. So it might lend credence to the idea that a lot of his struggles are related to just the typical adjustment to the longer NBA three-point line, because he seems to be disproportionately struggling from above the break and the top, which is where you have the biggest gap. And maybe that's thrown his, mechanics out of whack because he's trying to compensate for the extra distance, and that's tough to do on the fly. Do you find some confidence in that perhaps, if you squint hard enough, that a lot of this is just the longer line?
I'm glad you brought it up because that was something I was going to mention. Again, it's not an excuse for Jabari, but I do think some of this is strength, leg issue adjustment from, strength in the legs, adjustment to the league. I'm not going to chalk all that up to that, but I think that's a big part of it. He's shooting 26% from 25 feet out. That's where most of his above the break threes are coming from. And you brought up a great point about the 37% from the corners, which is good. It's not like great for a corner 3-point percentage, but it's still good. I think it's from the right corner. Yeah. From the right corner, he's much better than the left. But it's the lack of attempts there. I think he's got like 54 attempts from the corner and like 236 above the break. In general, I don't want to turn this into a team-wide issue, but it is a massive issue for the Rockets. I think they are by far as ratio of corner threes to above the break threes, the worst in the league at 18%. And I think the teams that lead the league are around 30%. So it's a big problem for the Rockets, and it reflects on Jabari as well. But yes, he is better from the corners, and hopefully as he gets stronger, more accommodated to the league, that he'll start knocking down those 25-plus foot shots.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you brought up about the shot chart and how he's shooting from different spots, because I have his college numbers like right in front of me. And it's interesting because in college, his worst spot shooting the three was actually just the top of the key, so the longest shot there was in college. So there is something to be said about just it being him adapting to the three-point line. And as we know, with the NBA nowadays, these guys rarely get to practice, so it's really hard to make in-season adjustments and just get better as a player with anything other than just your game time. That being said, I do have a question about the biggest point of discussion about Jabari on Twitter the last few weeks, which is the Silas quote on not running plays for him. Do you think that the fact that we now know that it is on purpose, that he has no plays run for him, do you think that affects his shooting? Do you think perhaps in a situation now without KPJ and Jalen Green, do you think that him getting those chances might help him, big back up his percentages? And if so, in which ways, would you think are best to, give him those chances? Is it, coming off of screens, or maybe trying to give him the ball, have him bring the ball up and transition into pull-up threes, which he has done, I would say, pretty well so far. So the question basically becomes, do you think that it has to do with that, and how would you use him if you think so?
Oh, man, that's a good question. So, I think in fairness, I think Silas, he's such a nice guy. I think he was trying to compliment Jabari as in to say, and he's doing this without me running plays, and did not realize that this was going to probably backfire in his face a little bit. But there is definitely some truth to that. I think most people noticed this early on, even with Jabari and some other players. We could definitely talk about KPJ and Jalen, but a lot of this is, self-creation from their two guard spots. I do think a point guard would help Jabari a lot. Again, it's not an excuse for him missing open shots. Not blaming any of this on KPJ, but I think a more experienced point guard who sets guys up, it would help them create more shots in the corner as a team in general as well, to have a more experienced point guard. Jabari in general, you brought up good cases. I think him off of motion, coming off of screens, would be terrific. We talked about the whole, taller Klay Thompson. Obviously, that's a far way off right now, but we would like to see him be more of a movement shooter. But when I think of plays for Jabari, I think of some of the things that he succeeded with at Auburn, and that was at the high post, in the elbow, or from the elbow, sort of getting the ball, squaring up, and shooting up over guys. We've seen it here and there, but not very often. And I do think, outside of the shooting, long distance, there have been some encouraging developments with Jabari. But I would like to see him see more the Rockets in general be more aware of him and using him as a weapon. It's just I agree with the assessment. I think you tweeted this once before, Paulo. Is it's tough to make that argument right now given how poorly he's shooting.
Yeah, I think the point guard comment is an astute one. I think that's one that you could sell me on. It's tough for me to get on board with they need to be running plays for this guy on a team in which for the majority of the season he's been clearly the worst of the 5 creators in the starting lineup because he's been playing alongside KPJ, Jalen Green, Eric Gordon, and Alperen Şengün. So if you're going to run plays for him, who are you taking touches and reps away from to do that when he's clearly the worst of the 5? And say what you will about trying to build his confidence, but you can easily send it the other way as well. You can make his confidence worse. So I think a better way to look at it, it's less about running plays and it's more about just quite frankly, finding him when he's open, getting the passes there on time in the shooting pocket, which is what a point guard can do. It's less about we need to call this play to run it for him, which when the Rockets are fully healthy, granted they aren't now, as we mentioned earlier, it's just tough to see, especially when he's shooting this poorly, the case for that. But yes, overall, he's the type of player, since at this point in his career, it's not like he's really creating his own offense a lot, that would disproportionately value from having more structure, having a point guard, having a guy that's going to hit him, in the perfect shooting pocket so that it helps his mechanics a little bit, because clearly he's adjusting on the fly to all these changes, as you said earlier. Dave, to quickly follow up on what you said there, what are the other areas of his game that you see are coming around? Because I think a lot of us were so focused on the shooting for the obvious reason, because it's so frustrating to see this guy build as an elite shooter when to this point it's been a huge weakness, that we don't even notice or watch the other stuff. So what are some of the other things that you see him doing better in, January and February relative to October, November, and December?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, some of this is eye test, some of it's the actual stats. I think early on, some of the weaknesses of Jabari, we're talking about finishing inside and certainly self-creation, right? I mean, as you compare him to somebody like Paulo, it's, night and day as far as somebody who can, you can just hand the ball to face up on somebody and make something happen, right? That's a completely different player type. I think he's gotten better there. I'm not saying he's great or really good at that facet of his game right now, but I think he's gotten a lot better, and he's very willing, and which I like to see, very willing to try to go by his guy and try to make something happen, especially going to his left. He seems like he's been quite effective there. Also, the finishing around the basket. Some of this is volume. Like I said, he's not a guy who's going to create a ton of shots, but I think the first 20 games inside 5 feet was like 50% from the arc on about two attempts per game in those first 20. And I think the last 20, it's almost 75%. And on this season, I think restricted area, that's well within the 5 feet range. He's been more efficient than Alperen Şengün, for example. Now, the volume is obviously different. I think it's about, a third or a little more than a third of the shots that Alperen Şengün gets there in that bracket. But he's gotten a lot better. If you take a look at the inside, the arc shooting between, since the first 20 games or so on, it's definitely improved. But his 3-point shot has abandoned him, and I think that has certainly masked everything else. We're also seeing a trend, I think, where, he came out of the gate. The first game this year, he took 11 threes. He hasn't taken that many since. I think there might have been one other game where he took 11. They were both against his hometown, by the way, Atlanta. But we haven't seen him do that since. And he was taking, I think, 6-7 threes a game for the first 20 and is taking 4 to 5 since then. So it's, we want to see him get his 3-point confidence back, but I think he's more confident, more aggressive in attacking the basket and shooting inside the arc.
Yeah, I was browsing through some stats. I just got access to Synergy for the NBA, and so when you get a new toy, you're always playing around with it.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, one of the things that people don't give Jabari any credit for, and to be fair, it's on low volume, right? But on isolation plays, and this means perimeter ISOs. Post-ups don't really count, even though they're kind of an ISO. Which means, face-ups, taking guys off the dribble on the perimeter. He has 26 possessions on this. And he is
on the season?
On the season. And he is 63rd percentile, which is, out of all of the list of plays, is what he's best at, although on low volume. Close to it is offensive rebounds and putbacks, which we know he's good at because he's, a hustle player. I think it would be interesting going forward, since the season's lost anyways, and you have two guys who are high volume shot takers in Kellen and KPJ hurt, to explore this a little bit. Because this is throughout the entire season, and I agree with Dave when he says that Jabari's gotten a lot better at just scoring inside and either drawing a foul, through contact or just finishing through contact himself. It would be interesting to, dig a little deeper on this and make these 26 possessions over the year so far. You could pretty much double this in 3 games, and it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for number 3 overall pick without the 2 main shot creators on the floor. I just wanted to point out that while it doesn't look great, there's a few things that we haven't given him a chance, because it's not really his archetype to do it. But who knows? It was also his archetype to be a sharpshooter, and he's not been that so far. So perhaps that's one way that you'll get him going, is just let him try stuff he hasn't gotten to try until now.
And by the way, another thing that I wonder about, did you guys notice the pictures of Jabari and Şengün at the All-Star game?
Yeah.
It was striking how Jabari easily cleared him in terms of height, even though they're both listed at 6'11". And that's when I keep coming back to the fact that Jabari is not just 19, he's a young 19. He's the youngest in his draft class. It would not be unfathomable if he ends up actually being 7'1", in which case, even if he's not the most explosive, which clearly he isn't in terms of his burst, he doesn't really have that quick twitch Russell Westbrook type gene. I know Russ is a guard, but I just use him because he's the first example that I think comes to mind for that kind of, elite burst. And clearly, Jabari can look a little bit stiff, but all of a sudden, if he goes from 6'10", 6'11" to 7'7", that's the kind of, just that extra couple of inches in an NBA context in terms of finishing near the rim. That's a huge deal. And all of a sudden, even if maybe his shooting isn't quite what it was billed at, all of a sudden, if he's still growing, if he becomes a legit 7 foot or 7'1", that could sort of change his profile, to sort of offset that in a positive way, right?
I 100% agree with that. Now it's hope, right? It's
Right.
Hope that he's still growing. But we saw the same thing. I was trying to find a smoking gun picture because I saw the video of just those guys back and forth, and I was like, man, I was trying to look at different perspectives. I'm like, is he in front of him or what? But it did strike me because you can see the shoulders. It's not just like where that, the top of the head is, but you can see the shoulders are definitely higher than Şengün's. And if he's growing, Rockets also are in business. I mean, a lot of this is, again, hinging on that shot coming back. But if you got a 7-footer who, again, we're going off of guesswork, ends up having that kind of shot that we expect, that's just a huge deal for the Rockets.
Let me ask you one more Jabari specific question before we transition to some offseason hypotheticals that may involve Jabari. I think we're focusing a little bit more on the offseason because let's be real, the Rockets are 13-45. This is dreadful to watch. We're all just trying to run the clock out until we get to the offseason and the draft lottery. Do they get Victor or Scoot? # pray for Victor. And then, of course, the draft itself, free agency with up to $60 million in cap space. Do they get James Harden? So on and so forth. So, yeah, we're going to talk a bit more offseason than we do the rest of this current campaign. Sure. However, when it comes to Jabari specifically, one way that I think, some people give him a bit of an unfair rap, his closest comparison throughout this year is Paulo Banchero of the Magic. Because obviously going into the draft, a lot of people thought that Banchero was going to go to the Rockets, that Jabari was going to go number 1. It ended up flipping. Orlando shocked the world. And of course, there's no Chet Holmgren, who went number 2. He hasn't played a minute all year because he broke his foot in the offseason. So in terms of those top 3 bigs, Paulo and Jabari are the only ones playing. And Paulo came out so strong in those first, 10 or 15 games. He looked like just a clear rookie of the year frontrunner, which he still might win it.
Yeah,
but he's definitely slowed down considerably since. The volume stats are still there at like 20 points, 6.5 rebounds per game. But when you look at the percentages for the year now, he's 41 point something from the field and 28% from 3. Over his last 36 games since early December, basically well over 2 months, he's shooting below 40% overall. Really, his stats, at least from a percentage perspective, look not that different from Jabari. And while Paulo is more of a creator at this point, and there is value in that, don't get me wrong, it's also a reminder that look, it's really, really difficult when you're 19, 20 years old and you've only played one season of college basketball to then all of a sudden go to playing in the NBA against grown men. It is a major adjustment. And I think so much of the narrative got set in place in the first 10 games that Paulo is this stud, Jabari looks like a bust, and especially on social media, first impressions are hard to overcome. Yet, if you look at the totality of the evidence, Banchero has still been better, don't get me wrong, but I think the margin is a bit closer than what some of the conventional thinking would lead you to believe. And I find a little bit of consolation in that. I'm not going to worry so much about the narratives because, truth be told, they don't matter. At the end of the day, whether these players develop or not, that's going to tell the tale as far as justifying their draft selection and what the long-term outlook is. What we think on social media now, it's just annoying. It doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme. But in terms of actually projecting Jabari's future, the fact that in reality, Paulo is having some of the same struggles as a player in the same draft class, the same age, the same position, does it not make you feel a little bit better about Jabari and realize that, hey, he's not alone? And of course, I know a counterexample, you can point to Keegan Murray with the Kings. Well, there's a couple of things different about Keegan Murray. Number one, the surrounding infrastructure with the Kings, De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis, way better than Orlando or Houston. And then secondly, Keegan Murray is 22 years old. He's a grown man. Paulo and Jabari are much younger. The surrounding infrastructure is not as good. And when you look at Banchero struggling as well, I find a little bit of consolation that, Jabari's struggling, but, his closest contemporary in terms of, where they were picked, the type of situation they were drafted into, he's going through some of the same things. Do you find some consolation in that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it's not just Paulo. I think, for example, Mathurin, had an incredible first impression. First couple months was hitting 40 to 45% from three. And everybody was like, wow, this guy's better than Jalen. He's better, than a lot of other players. He was ready to go and shooting like that. And I think since then, something like this, again, I'm pulling this from memory, since December 1st, I think he's like 24% from three. So yeah, rookies are, even Cade has not been, he's been injured this year, but I'm saying his rookie year and what he played this season has not been efficient at all. In fairness to Paulo, the same thing that we're looking at Jabari, he could get more efficient. And there's a lot of things to like about Paulo. I think one thing, that I would say surprised me, probably the only thing that surprised me about Paulo this year is his ability to get to the line. He's getting to the line like a top 10 player, or in the top 10 as far as his free throw attempts per game, which is incredibly odd for a rookie. But I guess there's reason to project that. But yes, it's like he's been remarkably inefficient. And that first impression, I think a lot of people are sticking to that and not realizing that he also is struggling in a different way. But they are completely different player types. For me, if Paulo, becomes more efficient, is a solid or pretty good defender and becomes better from 3-point range, then I think his player type would surpass what I envisioned for Jabari. But I think, Jabari, he's still a far cry from it, from what we've seen so far. I still like him overall in the long game simply because of the two-way potential and the 3-point shooting. But again, that's still in theory. We haven't seen it too much yet this season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look, one of the things that makes you feel better about what's happening with Jabari is you look around, and besides Keegan Murray, in the top 8 guys, although in different situations, you've got Paulo who's struggling with his efficiency, as you said. It's not like it's a a garden of flowers just fully blossoming around him. It's gets hurt. Paulo's being inefficient. Keegan's in a situation where he's not asked to do much, and I would argue that 3 years from now, Jabari Smith will be better than what Keegan Smith is right now. So the age difference is that big. Jaden Ivey himself, which is someone who a lot of people argue the Rockets should have picked instead, he's down to 43% true shooting on the season. It's not like he's having a great season. Ben Mathurin is at 32 from three for the year after that hot start. Shaedon Sharpe is basically a role player for the Trailblazers. Dyson Daniels is a backup point guard for the New Orleans Pelicans. So it's not like you look at the draft board and you think, oh, the Rockets messed up. They should have picked someone else.
By the way, as a quick interjection, I saw Bleacher Report this week did a redraft and they dropped Jabari, I want to say to 5 or 6, but they held Chet at 2. And I thought that was hilarious because somehow Chet is benefiting from not playing. So many guys, including Jabari, because they play and go through the rookie struggles, they sort of get punished. And somehow,
Yeah.
at least in terms of the narrative, Chet benefits from breaking his foot and not playing because it sort of keeps the halo, if you will, that we all had around these rookies when they were drafted last June.
He still goes number 2 in every redraft that I've seen.
Right.
It's kind of funny.
Yeah,
but
somehow not playing has benefited his narrative. Amazing.
It's exactly right.
Yeah, it's crazy. People still have the memory of those summer league games, or was it summer league? I think where he was just popping off.
Right.
And a lot of it's just the last game you saw from a player for a casual fan just drives the narrative, and that's just how it is. We've known that about all of our young guys throughout their course thus far. That being said, and for me now onto the fun part, let's talk off season. Let's talk plans. Sure. How do you build this team? Since it's All-Star break and they aren't playing and we aren't busy, complaining about the coaching or complaining about someone not making shots,
or complaining about the officiating,
or that as well. A lot of people have been talking about, the team building strategy going into next offseason. And one of the most talked about factors is we are about to have 4, I would say, top 10 level prospects on our hands. I think Şengün's easily proven that he's worthy of that category. And so you're now going to have Jalen Green, Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün, and the pick this year, and there's talks about bringing James Harden back. And so a lot of people are talking about, consolidation, or a lot of people are talking about trading one of these young guys that needs the ball in their hands for someone else who might fit better. My question is, going into the offseason, if you had to rank the 4 most valuable assets for the Rockets right now, and you can give caveats as to if James Harden's here, if he's not, if you think that that's a strong enough possibility that it should be mentioned, how would you rank Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr., and the upcoming pick in the 2023 draft? How would you rank them from most willing to trade versus least willing to trade?
Okay, so of those 4 most willing to trade to least willing to trade, and you're talking about trading that pick before the lottery?
No. Okay. I think
if it's 3 through 5,
you can give some
6.
hypotheticals there because clearly, my guess is that if it's Victor or Scoot, that goes to the front of the line, even ahead of Jalen, right? Okay.
Exactly.
So, you know what? Let's say hypothetically that it's not Victor or Scoot, that it's someone in the, Brandon Miller, Cam Whitmore class. Because I think, if you get Victor or Scoot, that's sort of obvious. That instantly becomes like the number 1 asset in your organization. I think most people agree. So let's go with unfortunately, the 73% scenario that it's someone in the very good but not, transcendent tier of this draft. Let's compare those to, Jabari, Şengün, and Jalen.
Okay, it's tough. I'm going to get killed for this answer, I'm sure. But okay, so most likely to trade versus or most valuable, correct? To least valuable, or one?
Either way, honestly.
To make it interesting, I'll say not likely, but if you are on the GM's position, who would you trade? Because there's a lot of play between. Sometimes you want to trade the guy that has the most value right now versus the guy that you think is going to be better on the long term. So it's a nuanced question. You can answer however you feel like it.
Sure. So I'll just say who I would trade. And matter of fact, I'll even predict that he will get dealt, but that's just a prediction. I'm going to say Şengün first, likely to be dealt. This is where it gets a little tougher for me. I would probably say Jabari next, then the pick, then Jalen. That's how I still believe that there's star upside in Jalen. We're getting a little late in the game. I'm hoping he can show more, but I still believe in him. So I'm going to have him as the most valuable asset there. But if I'm taking that pick and ranking it there, 3 through 5, I'm looking at Brandon Miller, the Thompson twins, a few other guys that I think could be really good prospects. So I'm putting that 3rd. So I'm going Şengün, Jabari, the pick, and then Jalen.
What's the rationale for you as far as Şengün versus Jabari? Because I think the conventional wisdom would definitely have Jalen and the 2023 pick as your top two assets, even if it's not Victor or Scoot. This is still a pretty strong draft class in terms of the 3 through 5 range, which right now, if the Rockets can hold on to the worst record in the league, then you would actually have the floor of pick 5. So Şengün and Jabari. To this point, clearly Şengün has been a better player this season. Now, granted, he is a sophomore, whereas Jabari is a rookie, so that explains some of it. But I think the case for Jabari, and I think I side with this as well, is that he's much more plug and play. There's so many scenarios that Jabari fits into because, at least on paper, assuming those skills eventually translate to 3 and D, like you talked about, Dave, then that can fit into a number of scenarios. Where with Şengün, clearly he's got to have the ball in his hands, and there's some scenarios where certainly if James Harden comes back, are there too many cooks in the kitchen? We even talked about this season when Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green were out there and they struggled to give Şengün enough touches. So with Şengün, if you're going to have all these other guys, you have to worry about, are you just artificially going to be capping his value anyway because you're not giving the touches? The other thing is that you just look at the deficiencies. Right now, Şengün is definitely a better player, but Jabari's deficiencies, at least some of them, there's a pretty clear route to improvement. He's just got to get the shooting back to, his college and high school data, and not just that, but where all the scouts, the experts believe that he can be based on not just his data, but also studying his form, his mechanics. There's lots of really, really smart people qualified that know what they're doing that bought in on Jabari Smith being an elite shooter. So we shouldn't be out on that just based on 55 games of his rookie season for a dreadful Houston Rockets team. The flip side is with Şengün, his biggest weakness is on the defensive end, and it's just tough for me to see dramatic improvement long term because I just don't see the tools. It's one thing with Jabari, the tools are there. He's just got to do it, at least in terms of the biggest weakness is the shooting. With Şengün, I don't think it's that he's necessarily not trying. It's just in terms of the traditional rim protection skills, the shot blocking, I just don't know that he has it. And if that's the case, then that may always put something of a cap on his value. Whereas with Jabari, not going to say that his future is limitless. Clearly, he's a little bit stiff. I don't think anybody's ever expecting him to become, truly Kevin Durant, scoring 30 plus per game. I mean, that's a bit aggressive. But I just don't know that he has quite the cap that Şengün does because there's not quite the same glaring deficiency. So to me, it's a bit of a gamble because Şengün is definitely better now. But I think just the overall utility of Jabari, the fact that you can put him into so many different scenarios and he still makes sense, that combined with the fact that there's less of a clear ceiling for him the way that there could be with Şengün due to the defense. To me, that's the distinguishing factor. Does that make sense to you?
100%. And I hope that the way I ranked him wasn't misunderstood because I agree with everything you just said.
Right.
I put Şengün at the top there because I think Şengün is the most likely.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I was just explaining. Yeah, I was just explaining. That's why I think that it makes sense.
And I wouldn't necessarily think he's the most valuable, but he, and I know that I deal with people on Rockets Watch. We talk all the time about this, and I know a lot of people get upset about it. And I understand he is probably, or arguably, in offensively, the best player on the team. He's, incredibly smart. He's gifted in so many different ways. I just, if you put a few things together, just kind of how the Rockets view him, how what they're trying to build here. Given the fact that I don't think that they're just loaded with a ton of future picks, and they are going to probably have to make some type of deal to get some players in here to help them take that leap. Şengün it's almost, popping off the page as the trade candidate for me, because I do think if you put in a guy, heck, a Walker Kessler. I mean, I know that you don't just get a Walker Kessler, but just some sort of rim protecting center. I think it helps your offense is going to still get some shots if you bring in a point guard, and it could help anchor your defense, which has a lot of issues on the perimeter. Certainly, it's just the way I think the Rockets view it is why I'm leaning that way, because they have a very kind of a view of this team building for the modern NBA, and Şengün is a gifted player. It's just very tough to see that. And when you consider the scenarios of like maybe Harden coming back, or even Wemby or Scoot or whatever, it's just always harder to figure out how Şengün figures into this whole thing, given that you would think his greatest strength is more of a primary, a guy you're going to run the offense through. That's why I think he's probably going to be the expendable one in the offseason.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's something that I always come back to is we're seeing a guy like Sabonis have some level of success. We haven't seen it in the playoffs yet, we're seeing Nikola Jokic have a level of success. We're seeing different types of team building to what we saw over the last, 7, 8 years in the NBA have success. And I can't stop but thinking that during those, 7, 8 years where the Warriors were dominating, basketball was basically optimized to what is the closest it's ever been to its fullest extent. And now we're slowly moving back to more parity, and that's why you're allowed to build teams in different ways. I think if a team achieves, and the closest team to achieve this is the Celtics, if a team ever achieves the same type of build that the Rockets had or tried to achieve with James Harden, in their prime years of, you've got an engine, and then you've got a bunch of switchable defenders that can shoot, you've got a pick and roll partner, there's some variations to it. I think that's still basically the recipe, and that's the sense I get from watching the way this team wants to play and watching the way they're drafting. That's what I feel like they're going after, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. That being said, my question is not about that. My question is, a lot of people talking about James Harden. You've mentioned it yourself. The first question is, James Harden coming back this season. Are you in or are you out? And then afterwards, if he does come in, does that change, you know, who you'd be more willing to put on the trade market to go get an upgrade or a vet, and what position would you target, that consolidation trade at? Would it be a point guard or a small forward or whatever it is?
I mean, I really think there's a lot of smoke on this Harden thing. I mean, a lot of people think that this is going to happen. There's just a lot of other additional reasons, kind of more private reasons, but there's a lot of talk about him coming back here, and that don't make sense to people who just look at this for basketball reasons. So I think that this might happen. It's something definitely to keep in mind. I think if you get Wemby, you hit that 14% chance it really could happen.
Pray for Victor.
Yeah, exactly. But I think he's your point guard if you get him. So I don't think you would necessarily target a point guard. I mean, I know others have made good arguments about how Şengün could fit with Harden. I think that my personal belief is it would be a tough defensive sell. I think he would look more for a rim running or pick and roll partner. But it is interesting. I think that's the way the Rockets want to build. And I have to admit, I lean on that same philosophy. That's the modern NBA. That's the way we're going. Everybody can switch. Everybody can hit threes. Everybody can defend everybody. But if everybody can do that, if every team is aiming to do that, what's next? How can you expose that type of philosophy and find a weakness in that? I know Daryl Morey has talked about that recently, about how Joel Embiid has kind of given him that because teams don't have players, they don't stock up just 7-foot plotting centers to give them a tough time in the paint, so they can expose it that way. And is Şengün a representative of something like that? Could the Rockets think outside the box, as you were talking about, Paulo, and like Sacramento or Denver, and build a team in a different way? I think their philosophy is that's not a championship route, and that's why I think he's expendable. Or why I think he will be. I mean, they still have high hopes for him, but I'm saying when they get to that point and they look at the asset pile of what they have to move, I think Şengün's going to be the one that gets moved. That's just, again, my feeling. And I think you would target either picks to relay to someone else, in a deal that comes up. Obviously we've talked about Mikal Bridges on the high end, but I think it would be more to move it for picks and then seek out the exact type of player that you want around a Harden, or whatever you end up getting in the draft.
So I've got a question for both of you guys, and when I get to it, I'm sure both of you are going to recoil, and our listeners may as well. So I'm going to preface it with a little bit of context. I was putting together a player grades. Yeah, I was putting together a player grades piece for Rockets Wire today, going through basically the entire roster that's played 10 plus minutes per game that's still there. And I was going through the various numbers, and all the grades are relative to, it's not just how well they play, because it's sort of boring if because obviously a starter is probably better than a bench player, but that goes without saying. For me, the grades are always relative to, the role, the expectations, where they fit in the rebuild. It's a confluence of factors. Basically, how are they playing relative to where you started the season, thinking of these guys as your puzzle pieces. And so I went through the entire roster. If you want to go to rocketswire.usatoday.com, spoiler alert, even though I do think he's a trade candidate, actually gave Alperen Şengün the highest grade of an A- of anyone on the roster. I gave Tari Eason and KJ Martin B+. I was really struggling with where to grade Kevin Porter Jr. And I landed on a B- because clearly he's not a point guard. Now, granted, it's not like he just directly asked for that role. That was a decision from the front office. And certainly he's not a strong defensive player, although neither is really anybody on the current team, especially after trading Eric Gordon. I guess Jae'Sean Tate is potentially the one exception, although he's just playing about 20 minutes per game now. But if you look at the actual percentages, KPJ has actually been pretty efficient. He has a similar shot chart and similar profile to Jalen Green, but more efficient. Now he is year 4 compared to Jalen being year 2, although it sort of feels like KPJ is year 3 since his year 2 was just a total washout between the off-court factors, the trade to Houston, the G League, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of where he fits long term, the reason I said B- was because if it was just the numbers, you actually might could give him a B or a B+. He has taken a step forward. He is finishing better. And up until his injury, about the last 6 weeks, he had really improved. The true shooting percentage, I want to say, was above 58. There was some really encouraging stuff. But the reason I settled on a B- is that I don't know where his archetype actually fits. He's not the point guard. We agree on that. You need more structure. We talked about that earlier. And then while he is 6'6", you can move him to a wing role. I'm not sure if it makes sense for him and Jalen to both be starters because there's so much of an overlapping skill set there. It may make more sense for the guy in that small forward spot to be a guy who provides more basically off-ball value in terms of, I guess, what KJ Martin does, but perhaps a KJ Martin with better defense. That's why people have thrown around like the Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson hypotheticals for this offseason. Basically, with all the cooks you have, and you're probably going to be adding more in terms of the draft, perhaps James Harden, then you need some guys that can succeed without the ball in their hands. So that sort of takes KPJ out of that role, in my opinion. And then, you could try him as a sixth man. It's worth noting he has a very favorable contract, but I just don't know that KPJ would buy into that. Because he is, he's playing better. He's averaging, say what you will, but 26-6, it is a thing. He's just 22, 23 years old. And that's a big ask for a guy who is probably thinking, hey, I'm putting up reasonably good numbers on decent efficiency as a starter. Now it is a starter for the worst team in the league. I understand that, but still it's a lot to ask. So a lot of the scenarios, I understand why people think about sending him out because he's young enough. He does have some value, given credit. Unlike previous years, there haven't been any off-court incidents. He seems to be handling himself well in the locker room. His teammates all speak well of him. And, he's young. He has some talent. And he's basically, because of the unique contract the Rockets got him on with that extension, he's almost like an expiring every year. Well, he isn't expiring for next year. The team options, if you hold on to him for the next summer in 2024, you'd have to guarantee 2 years. So that's the only period that he's not expiring. And even then, it's still limited with 2 years. So a lot of people look at KPJ more as a trade asset because it's tough to see KPJ and Jalen where the long-term fit is for both of those guys, unless KPJ takes a bench role, and that may be a lot to ask. So I think a lot of us have sort of just thought to ourselves, okay, KPJ is going to be, an outgoing salary matching piece in a trade. Maybe it's for James Harden, maybe it's for something else. And it is useful to have mid-tier salary matching filler. With all that said, while I am not advocating for this scenario, if someone is willing to pay peak value for Jalen Green that really believes in him for one reason or another, and you have an internal candidate on a very team-friendly contract in KPJ, who at least right now is playing very similarly in terms of his style to Jalen Green, actually a bit more efficient. Now, I understand that, he's a couple of years more advanced. I also understand that Jalen clearly has more upside than Kevin does. Again, I'm not disputing that at all. What I'm saying is that in this thought exercise earlier, if someone is really, really sold on Jalen and willing to give you, peak value for him, and the fact that you do have another young guy on a very team-friendly deal that you could slot into that Jalen role, again, I'm not trying to sell you on KPJ as a point guard. I'm completely out on that. I think we're all on the same page. Would the fact that you have a ready-made scoring wing replacement perhaps move the scale just a little bit in terms of being open to dealing Jalen? Not saying I would pursue it. In fact, I probably wouldn't. I agree that Şengün and then Jabari are guys that if I have the choice that I would easily trade ahead of Jalen. And depending on where the 2023 pick lands, it's possible I could still have Jalen as the best blue chip. I think I'd still prefer Jalen over Cam Whitmore, for example. But I've just sort of, just as a thought exercise, the fact that Kevin Porter Jr. isn't that much older, has a fairly similar shot profile. I know that Jalen and KPJ aren't necessarily the best mix together, but the fact that, conceivably there's a drop-in replacement there, does that make you think at all about, some of the Jalen scenarios? Again, this is just abstract, nothing concrete, just speaking very broadly. What do you think about that?
No, it's brave that you brought it up, and I agree. It's funny because I didn't realize you were going to go into Jalen possibilities there, and as you were talking, I'm like, well, I don't view KPJ as a point guard at all. I don't think he'll be a point guard next year, and I know the Rockets have talked about maybe moving him to 3. I don't really believe that either, and I'm thinking he's really he's really a 2 or a 6 man, and it's definitely gutsy is what I would say, like to sacrifice Jalen.
It's more just sort of playing devil's advocate compared to the conventional wisdom,
right? And I will say this in fairness to KPJ, as far as like just the numbers, he's been a better 2 guard this year than Jalen has. That's a fair assessment, and he's also young. For a variety of reasons, I'm not sure I would build on a foundation of KPJ. I'd like him better as a 6 man for this team, and I still want to lean into Jalen. But I mean, I don't think there's anybody on this team that you say, no way we can trade that guy. There just isn't. They haven't had any kind of success or significant progress with anybody that says yes, absolutely. It's one of the kind of unfortunate consequences of this season, how it's gone the first 58 games, is we haven't seen enough progress from anybody to say, yes, that's your clear fire foundation. So while I'm not in my mind thinking trade Jalen at all, you have to be open to that possibility. And you basically are thinking, you're playing 3D chess or 4D chess, whatever, there. And it could be a wise course if something really strong comes to the table. But I do like long-term Jalen at the two guard better than KPJ.
Yeah, I do too. It's just a thought exercise because right now, KPJ is a little bit better. And of course, there's reason to be. He's more advanced in his development. But when I just looked at the numbers and I just started thinking, it's like, well, in theory, you'd like to have a piece like Kevin Porter Jr. There is talent there. It's tough. The reason I gave him sort of a low grade relative to his numbers, it's just tough to see what the long-term fit is. And I just started thinking about it, and I was like, well, unless, and I agree, it's very unlikely. Jalen Green is your foundation. It's just never say never, and it's one of those things that's just going to be in the back of my mind, something that will
100%.
Probably never come to fruition, but just an option that you conceivably have. Paulo, am I completely off base, or do you at least see where I'm coming from?
I see where you're coming from. As an hypothetical, I'm with Dave in the sense that there's no one untradeable. I mean, if anybody's offering pick 2 in this draft for any of our guys, they can take him.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those situations where I would have to see what the actual offer is. I would have to see, because the Rocket situation is in such flux. I would need to see, is James Harden coming? I would need to see where am I picking in the draft. I would need to see all of those things. But in general, and just as a rule of thumb, while KPJ has not had any issues this season, I still don't trust his demeanor on the court to stay consistent at all times. He's still.
That's a fair question.
Yeah, and if we're talking about foundational pieces, I trust Jalen's mentality a lot more. I think he's checked out the season. So I don't really trust his demeanor on the court. And then, to me, it comes down to, I'm not making any team decisions based on the fact that KPJ is not willing to play 6 man. To me, it's like, okay, you're locked, your contract's locked up. It's not like you can just hit free agency unless we want you to.
That's a fair point.
To me, it's either if you want to play 6 man, you can stay. If you don't want to play 6 man, we'll find another solution. And worst case scenario, I'd even waive him. It's just, I'm not basing any decisions off of his willingness to play the 6 man role. I think that's his best position. I think he might be the better player right now compared to Jalen, but I also think that Jalen has made strides when it comes to his foul drawing. I think a better coach would do wonders for Jalen. I think we're pigeonholing him into this on-ball creator at all times, and I've always viewed him as more of a, not shot profile wise, but when he's on ball versus off ball, I've always seen him more as a a Steph Curry type in the sense that at least half the time or 40% of the time I want you running through screens and using your shot making ability, using your ability to very quickly get into your shooting motion. I'm using your speed to relocate. I'm using the fact that you're really shifty and really agile to get you in positions where, like Steph Curry, you're going to get space that other guys are not getting. And I think Steven House has done a terrible job this year, perhaps on purpose, perhaps it's a development strategy. I think that's one of the, I think Jalen in specific is one of the few things about organic learning that kind of makes a little bit of sense. Just because you're forcing him into this on-ball role because, he's going to need to be good at that, even if his eventual usage is not as prominent on ball as it's been. That being said, to answer your question, I've seen a lot more mentality-wise from Jalen to make me trust him uh, rather than trade him for the benefit of KPJ. But then again, nobody's untradeable, and if the offer's good enough, and
Yeah.
to me that is a top two pick in this draft, for example. If that's an offer, then yes, you have to consider it because you're the worst team in the league. There's no one untouchable unless you literally draft Scooter or Wemby, in my opinion. So that's basically where I'm at. I'm not completely against trading Kevin, but it would take very
Yeah.
specific
Fair,
circumstances.
yeah, fair point. And just to, reiterate, for me, it's not about, yeah, you'd be trading Jalen for KPJ. Absolutely not. It's just, do you sort of have that in the back of your mind if somebody overwhelms you for Jalen? I agree. Like, you would have to be overwhelmed no matter what. That would be the incentive.
And it's interesting because we didn't talk about this the way you described it yesterday, but we threw a Jalen scenario out there yesterday because I just wonder. I don't know if we're going to get to this point, but I do wonder with the lottery results coming up. There's a handful of teams that in this draft that just don't need a point guard. Indiana with Halliburton, you've got LaMelo Ball. I don't know how Charlotte views him long term, certainly, but he's a guy that's there. You could argue Detroit as well with kind of a Cade Ivy combination, right? Like, could they
Right.
use Scoot if they got the number 2 pick of the draft? If the Rockets are 3 or 4, is there any chance? Nobody's trading Wemby. You can just kiss, whoever gets number 1 is getting number 1. That's locked in. But is there any flexibility on 2 if one of those teams arrive there and they want a Miller or one of the Thompson twins long term, something like that? And that's when we were wondering about different bigger names getting involved for the Rockets.
Right. Let me take you a different direction with the Scoot Henderson hypothetical. That's really
Sure.
interesting. I was looking at it from the standpoint of, well, what if the Rockets land at 2? Certainly, if you're at 3 or 4, maybe there's a small window, depending on the team, especially Charlotte. Although I wonder in that scenario if Scoot Henderson is as generational as a lot of people think. I know our buddy Dakota might have some different ideas on that, but I think the conventional scouting certainly seems to love Scoot Henderson and buys into him, if not at Wemby's level, definitely still being generational. And so I wonder in that scenario, does Charlotte perhaps look into dealing LaMelo Ball? And if that's the case, I can see the
Correct.
Rockets definitely being in that market. Charlotte pivots to younger with the guy they have more club control on at a cheaper rate, and LaMelo could be getting to a stage in his career where maybe he's a year or two away from trying to leverage his way out of a bad Charlotte situation anyway that isn't that desirable for his brand either. So there's a lot of considerations that could go into it. But as far as the Rockets and 2, the other scenario, I agree. 2 is the most interesting spot because 1 is locked in. No matter what, if you get it, he's the most important asset in your entire organization. And if you don't, the team that gets him is not trading it. That's done. And at 3 or 4, if it's someone in the Brandon Miller, Cam Whitmore type tier, then okay, that's a pretty good prospect, but it slides in. Maybe they jump Jalen, maybe they're slightly behind Jalen, but it's nothing, transformational. 2, there's so many different options. And I think certainly if the Rockets get 2, I mean, you've got to take Scoot Henderson. I'd be very surprised if the Rockets moved off of Scoot themselves, given that gap. And we know the Rockets, Rafael Stone, Tillman Fertitta, these guys have talked a lot about prioritizing quality and star level talents, which Scoot definitely has relative to those other guys. And there is a hole right now at point guard. That said, we have also talked about bringing in James Harden while he'd be 34 years old. At least for the next year or 2, he's someone who operates with the ball in their hands. So my question for you, Dave, as far as a world where you, one way or another, land at 2, I guess the most likely is that the Rockets just end up at 2 themselves in the lottery. That's a 13% chance. But in this scenario you tossed out, I guess we can throw that in as well, where maybe they can trade for 2. Does your willingness to go after James Harden change if Scoot Henderson is in play and you already have a point guard that you feel better about, and thus, there's more of a premium to the touches that James Harden would be taking. Granted, he's older, he's in his 30s, it's not like James Harden would be like a super long-term piece, but do you perhaps have second thoughts about Harden if you have a Scoot Henderson type already in place at point guard?
Man, that is like I do. The answer to the question is I do. It's a great question. But it's also kind of like, well, what's the best use of the cap space? And somebody like Harden is a great use, right? Like if you're going to spend the money outright on somebody, Harden is one of the, probably the best option the Rockets have in the offseason. Are you going to pass on that? I'm definitely not going to pass on Scoot if he's there. If you have number 2 and you have the second pick. But could they both be on the same team? I mean, I'm thinking you want to hand the reins to Scoot as a point guard right out of the gate. That's not going to happen with James Harden here. But then again, they had Chris Paul and James Harden before, and most people would have thought on paper that's not going to work. I don't. That's a tough one. I mean, I'm taking Scoot regardless, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, okay, I don't necessarily need James Harden. We have a long-term foundational point guard. I don't know about generational, but certainly foundational. Like that is the guy we're going to run with. And I would argue he might be your very best prospect, period, on the team.
I think he would be.
Yeah. And so that would be your future, but it's kind of hard to pass on Harden. And if you pass on Harden, are you going to say, okay, we're going to go and try to fill this with Cam Johnson and restricted free agents or, trade. And that's hard to imagine. Yeah, I don't know if I've fully answered your question. I think I'm taking Scoot and I'm letting, if Harden still wants to come here, I'm probably going to do that because I think it's good value for use of the cap room, but it's less of a need.
Yeah. By the way, quick follow-up. Did you see the big brain tweet? I forget who it was. It was James Piercy. That's who it was. The Cam Johnson suggestion on the idea that you basically bait Brooklyn into overpaying him, and thus because you own their draft capital, you clog Brooklyn's books. And so either way you're set. Either you get Cam Johnson, he's restricted, of course, or if not, then you're making life harder for Brooklyn. I actually thought that was pretty interesting.
It is. It's very smart. I saw the same tweet. James is really good like that. And it is smart. Yes. And actually, that's one of the things I think just in general, regardless of the Brooklyn factories, the Rockets definitely need to be focusing on restricted free agents because that's where, Boston as well, Grant Williams, like you might be able to overpay, and those teams are just not going to be able to keep them. So Cam Johnson, Grant Williams are definitely guys to take a look at.
Yeah, so I have one last question. It was an hypothetical that I brought up on Twitter. In a situation where the Rockets fall to 3, and this is kind of a twofold question, do you have anyone that you have as clear number 3? Is there a different tier between 3 and 7? Is there some guys you prefer over others that are big enough to have to warrant a different tier? Because there's teams that are in a really interesting position. The Orlando Magic have 2 lottery picks. Right now, if nothing moves, it would be 2 and 7. But let's say that 2 teams below 7 jump up. And now Orlando has pick, I don't know, let's call it 6 and 8. And you have pick 3. And Orlando's in love with Amen Thompson, for example, because he's, a point guard. Would you think about trading back, for example, from 3 and you package that with the Clippers pick and you trade up, to 6? It's both a trade up and a trade down, but basically 3 and what is now 20 for pick 6 and pick 8, and you're basically taking 2 guys of perhaps a little bit of a lower tier. It depends on how you view them, of course. What do you think about some movement like that?
It's certainly interesting, and it depends on if you feel like the talent that you like the best, because I think there's enough variance in how people view this draft. I mean, a month or so ago, I was really high on Cam Whitmore. I still am, but I don't know if I have him necessarily 3. Brandon Miller's intriguing. Both the Thompson twins are intriguing for different ways, but for me, it's very tough to assess this overtime elite stuff. Those guys look like they are playing at a different speed, but it's just very hard for me to tell. And I am excited by their prospects. I think you've got to get the single one best guy. If you still feel like you can get the guy that you like the best at 6 and pick up 8 as well, I'm all for it, because I would love Anthony Black or Cason Wallace with pick 8, or somebody that you think could really contribute. But that game is only in my opinion, in the Rockets situation wise, if you still get the guy that you personally like the best. And that's if they go from 3 to 6 and pick up something else, I'm all for it.
Interesting. Any favorites beyond, Cam Whitmore?
I mean, like I said, I like those other guys. I do. I like Brandon Miller. Jarris Walker is super intriguing. But he also plays, kind of a similar position. It's tougher. The more you add these prospects, the harder it is to think fit, right? But like Jarris Walker he is a beast. I mean, this guy is going to be an animal. I don't know, if he's necessarily the best fit for the Rockets, but I think he's going to be really good in the league.
And Tillman would love marketing the U of H angle.
Yes, he would. He certainly would. But to answer your question, Paulo, not yet. I'm as late in the game and really deep diving on these guys. Like last year, you and I were, and everyone else, we were talking about this in late November. And like this year, I think it's because the top 2 picks are just so dominating the conversation, and it feels like there's a significant drop from 2 to 3. And I hope there isn't. I hope we start to see option 3, 4, and 5 really start to stand out, because as you guys know, tanking for Wemby is just a kind of a fool's affair for a whole entire season. Whereas tanking for a top 5 pick, hey, you can guarantee yourself that. And so, although I'll take the odds to get Wemby, certainly you just want to feel good about pick 5 because a lot of the scenarios have the Rockets there. So I don't have it just yet. But there's certainly a handful of guys that I think I'm gonna be happy if the Rockets pick.
One last question for me, and then we'll wrap up. In the scenario where you got to go down to plan D, plan E, plan F, where let's say James Harden changes his mind again, let's say you don't end up getting a Cam Johnson. I agree that you've got to look in the restricted market in terms of what you do with your cap space. There's no star that comes on the market that you can conceivably trade for. A lot of people have said in the past, I know that David Weiner, Beam of Thog on Twitter, has talked about, the idea of do you potentially, take on a bad contract for assets and try to roll over your space to a future year. Duncan Robinson's a hypothetical that's been thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier this week, I did Locked on Rockets with Jackson Gatlin, who, of course, you work with on Rockets Watch, and he threw out the possibility I hadn't considered of doing, a 1 year plus an option overpay type setup for a guy like Draymond Green, who may be looking to get paid. And of course, it serves multiple purposes. He, helps you get some instant relevancy. You get off the ground floor, so to speak. Eventually, he moves on to a team that's more ready-made to contend now. And while you wouldn't be getting, a future draft asset that way, you also wouldn't be clogging your books for 2024. And the more I think about it, I'm sort of intrigued. I mean, hopefully, the Rockets get James Harden. They're able to make an impactful trade. Perhaps they get a young guy like a Cam Johnson. We don't even have to think about these scenarios. But if you do have to sort of go down your list, I think I may be drawn more. I mean, I know Draymond, if the hypothetical I threw out earlier about trading Jalen and starting KPJ at the 2 was unpopular, bringing in Draymond Green may be even less popular than that, because everybody knows how people in Houston feel about him. But I just think, like, in a more sort of abstract sense, I'm more open to that than taking on the bad contract, because if you take on a bad contract to get any kind of decent draft capital, it's probably not going to be an expiring deal. It's going to be somebody with at least, a couple of seasons left that they're really trying to offload. And so if that's the case, you're going to be really, punting back your window to the mid 2020s, all the while Oklahoma City basically controls your draft capital. Yes, I know there's light protections. To me, the draft capital that you would have to get in a take a Duncan Robinson type scenario would have to be overwhelming, because in terms of what it would do for your timetable, I just don't know, especially because the Rockets already have, a decent amount of capital coming in from Brooklyn anyway. At this point, the more I think about how it actually looks in practice, I think I'm more drawn to just look at, first the restricted market and then the 1 year overpays. And worst case scenario, you try it again in 2024. You see what the market looks like then. You see who's, a trade candidate. I know Jaylen Brown is actually going to hit the market because of that quirk that, Boston can't give him the extension. So I don't know. To me, the 1 year overpay route all of a sudden becomes more attractive the more I think about it, relative to the taking on a bad deal that runs 2+ years in exchange for draft assets, because that's just punting your timetable, I think, way further back than what the Rockets would like.
Yes. No, it's interesting. Jackson brought that up. Draymond is a guy I've been eyeing for a while in the Harden scenario, which I think is a good possibility. And I don't know. I don't think necessarily Harden and Draymond have the best relationship, but you know how vets
Right.
kind of stick together. They want to, and the reason I think this is possible, I don't think Draymond wants to leave Golden State. I don't think they want him to leave either. But their tax issue is enormous. I think that they would probably try to move others before losing out on Draymond, because he is such a pivotal player for that
Right.
team. Like, he's just so critical. But I mean, you want to talk about a guy who would hold players accountable on the floor,
Sure.
expect a lot. I mean, maybe even to the risk of their safety, right? But still, I mean, like, he is a guy who is going to expect a lot. He's going to expect everyone to play defense, to have his back. He will have yours. I'm not a Draymond fan. I've always despised the guy because of all the battles we've gone with him. But as far as a good defensive player, a very good, veteran, a guy who, everybody else will hate except for the fans of, the team that he's on. He would, I think, significantly impact this team if you did bring in a Harden. He could play center in a lot of small ball lineups. There's just a lot of options with him. So I definitely think he is a possibility, but it's going to take an overpay. It's going to take something that Golden State can't, or, would be paying out the nose for to match. And so it would be interesting.
I guess the Jordan Poole parallel with the Rockets would have to be either Jalen Green or KPJ. So how many viewers do you think Rockets watch could get live if in training camp next year a report comes out that Draymond Green has punched either Jalen or KPJ in the face?
That would be something, I tell you what. I mean, it's funny. I think there's some fans who probably want that, but I think Draymond's probably learned his lesson, but this team definitely needs some sort of accountability. I'm not saying, Jalen and KPJ.
Not punch in the face accountability, but
yeah, exactly. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there with that image. I think that's an appropriate place to wrap up. Anyway, folks, thanks for listening to this long episode. Hopefully this gets you through the All-Star break. And perhaps if you're listening this weekend, if you need something to tune out, if the Rockets are getting blown out in Golden State or Portland, which they easily could be, those teams have a lot more incentive to play for. Also looks like the Rockets will still be without Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green based on Steven Silas's comments at Wednesday night's practice. So if you're listening then and you want to tune out on the game, think bigger picture, because there's better possibilities that could arise in just a few months for your Rockets. With that, we will finally wrap up. For Dave and Paulo, I'm Ben. If you want more content from us before our next show, the best place to get it is on Twitter. You can follow me on there at Ben DuBose, Paulo on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and Dave on there at Clutch Fans. You can also follow the show, The Logger Line, on Twitter at The Logger Line, where you can find our link tree. That's got links to basically every podcast distributor, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you want to listen. You can find it there. And you can also find links to our partners, Sports Talk 790, Carbach Brewing, Rockets Wire. You can find all of their content and opportunities there at the link tree of The Logger Line. Go there on Twitter. Last couple of plugs, the website's rocketswire.usatoday.com. That's where I'm the editor. You can read everything Houston Rockets all day long, rocketswire.usatoday.com, and also sports790.com. That's the official radio station of your Houston Rockets. Listen to all their content and shows on a daily basis. And that's where, of course, you can find our archives of the Logger Line as well, in addition to those aforementioned distributors. Finally, with those plugs out of the way, we will break. For Dave and Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.